All right, guys. Hi, hello. Welcome to the last unit of official review. Before, excuse me, we get into that's it. I mean, there's nothing else to get into. So we're going to talk about agriculture today. Again, looking at our chapter 10 in the textbook, and we're going to kind of just go through as much stuff as we can. You're going to see here that this map that's on the front here is important to keep in mind, remembering that one of the biggest or most important things to understand about agriculture is where certain types of agriculture happen, and that almost always is connected to the climate. Certain agriculture works better in certain climates, so just keeping that kind of in mind as you're doing your review, make sure you have that map or that visual somewhere so that you can kind of keep track of that all. So with that said and done, we're going to dive in, remembering to keep track of questions and concerns as you go, and getting that posted. So when we talk about agriculture, this is so weird because of the fact that we're not actually covering 6 and 7, but as far as content goes, but with our unit 5, we're talking about the primary sector of economies. And every country, state that has ever existed, their economies almost always start here. And over time, how much of the economy is made up of agriculture changes, depending on development. Excuse me. So, primary sector activities, remember, involve taking something out of the earth. So, with farming, again, it's the raising of crops or livestock, and then that is where they're going to get most of their money and things like that from. We know that there are particular hearths around the world that are agricultural in nature, where the first places where humans began to domesticate plants and animals. Hopefully, you remember those. Again, I'm not going to go through them. That's a map that you should have reference to somewhere, seeing kind of where those concentrations are. Most of the original hearths are happening in Southwest, Central, East Asia. That's where the big ones are. When we talk about this idea of an agricultural hearth, it's where the first humans stopped chasing their food, and that takes place during the first agricultural revolution or the Neolithic revolution. This first agricultural revolution enabled humans to settle down. To become sedentary, the idea of settling into one location, and instead of following the seasons and following migration of animals, they're going to stop and cultivate the plants and domesticate those animals to be able to get the things that they need in order to survive. During the first agricultural revolution, this is the first time that humans recognized the capabilities of using seeds, using animals. It allows for the creation of villages and towns, and this is really where you see more permanent modification of the environment, because you have to change the environment to be able to farm, and then you are going to add on top of it all of the culture that develops out of people settling in. And over time, this first agricultural revolution is going to transform pretty fast from just farming what you need for yourself to growing surplus, which of course again encourages other types of advancements of thinking irrigation and shortage technology so that you can kind of have a surplus. It's going to lead to trade. Of course, with more food and more regular food, and more work to be done to get that food. Family sizes are going to get bigger, so population density starts to increase. They're going to have more and more people living closer together, which allows for society to develop, for new, again, economic practices, new politics, new culture. This and revolution leads us through a pretty extended period of agriculture. It's not until the 16 going into 1700s where the second agricultural revolution starts to occur in Europe and North America. And what they're looking for here in this revolution is changing the way that, and people farm through increased efficiency. That's what they're looking for. So they're going to introduce new tools. These tools like the horse-drawn hoe, again, a seed drill. It makes life, it makes working on a farm easier. You don't have to have as many people. You're still getting as much food as you had before, actually even more so. And it leads to, of course, our industrial revolution. It all kind of falls on top of each other. So you have these first original tools in agriculture, and then that leads to the mechanization of manufacturing, so on and so forth. This, again, all of these revolutions lead to the migration of people from rural into urban space. And CDR is going to drop off right around a second agricultural revolution. Population is still growing because, again, you get people healthier, they can live longer, all that kind of stuff. When I talk about mechanization, I'm obviously talking about the idea of using tools as opposed to doing things by hand. A huge turning point after the Industrial Revolution gets going and the tools and mechanizations of industry start to find their way back into agriculture. The internal combustion engine allows for tractors, which allows for combines and reapers and all of these different big tools that allow for farming to happen at a big scale without a lot of people. So you're seeing that farm production is going to increase. And it really has a long-lasting impact on agriculture in countries that are going to become much more industrialized, because farming no longer is going to be small scale. I mean, it can't be. If they want to survive and make money, they have to kind of expand into much more commercial enterprises. It emphasizes focusing on one single crop and then getting the profits from that to buy all the other things that you need. And without the need for humans, again, we're going to see other sorts of advancements are going to, again, decrease the amount of people needed, actually. So fertilizers, tools, you get new seeds, you get new pesticides, things that humans would do in agriculture no longer exist because they don't have to. The third and final agricultural revolution that we've seen take place in the course of human history is the Green Revolution, which began in the mid-1970s. This is where science starts to, again, come into play at a much higher level than we saw in, again, the mechanization of the second agricultural revolution. In the third or green revolution, we're going to see that scientists develop those high yield seeds and they come up with new fertilizers. And ultimately, they're trying to use intensive agricultural tech. Okay, so that idea of a lot of really labor, again, a lot of work, a lot of man hours, a lot of time, all that kind of stuff, to help poor countries produce larger harvests without having to increase the amount of land that they have. Remembering that in a lot of, again, poorer countries in LDCs, farms are, and they use every inch of the land that they've got, but they don't have a lot of land. So in order to be able to kind of increase their yield, they wanted to find something overall. Of course, we see that most of those poorer countries can't afford those high yield seeds, so they stay within really the core, the more developed parts of the country, and then they've slowly diffused out into the periphery to try to stop world hunger. Again, the ones that are used worldwide are going to be those high yield rice, wheat, maize seeds, things like that. The introduction of those things have, again, had a positive impact, again, in China, Southeast Asia, India, increasing rice harvests. And like I said, not everyone can afford these. A lot of the poorer farmers of the world can't afford all of this kind of stuff. So not everybody benefited from the Green Revolution like you saw with the second or the first revolution. And there have been negative impacts as well, because these high yield seeds, again, it pushes the soil a lot harder. So it becomes less productive over time, and groundwater decreases. There's conflict over water. There's loss of biodiversity, native food crops. Again, so the negative ramifications of the Green Revolution have been varied, but again, there's a lot of them. So by the time we get to, excuse me, the more general descriptions of agriculture as it stands, modern commercial agriculture, again, it's all about profit. It's going to be the modern approach to trying to do this overall. The law of supply and demand, again, government minimizing risks and profits, it all influences the production of certain goods. And a lot of times in commercial agriculture, there's vertical integration. And what I mean by that is that these massive companies are going to own every step of the process of agriculture. And it changes it because it cuts out the middle person. So they're going to keep pushing to try and make more money. But again, there's no competition. So it's this really strange thing. The agriculture industry has really gone through it by this time. Okay. Again, something that's a little bit of an add-on that might show up. I don't know. It might show up. You never know. Is polyculture versus monoculture. I'm hoping that those prefixes, they're going to let you know right away. Polyculture is several crops are produced, animals are raised for labor, food, and clothing. Monoculture is just one. You just pick one thing. Okay. Again, we know that there are two sort of categories for the different types of farming that exist out there. There's commercial versus subsistence. Subsistence, again, the food production is primarily for consumption of the farmer's family. That does not mean that subsistence farmers aren't able to make a surplus and sell things. It's just not as often. Again, when we look at subsistence, a ton more people are actually working directly in farming. You need to, because most often the styles or the types of agriculture are more labor intensive. They need more people to actually work the land. They can't afford the types of technology that allow for that to go down. And again, most of the work is being done by hand with an animal. Commercial farming is, again, it's for sale. It's profit farming. Again, very few actual people work there because everything is highly mechanized. You don't need the people. Again, commercial agriculture, in order to be able to make any money, you have to have huge farm sizes. Again, you're going to be utilizing the newest and most advanced technologies, all that kind of stuff to be able to make ends meet, regardless of where or what kind of agriculture it is. It's all difficult. Agriculture is a difficult industry to be successful in. So this right here is looking pretty much at just a kind of a base description of who's producing what. Again, as far as a grain goes, China leads the world in the amount of output that they have, followed up by the European Union, though, of course, because it's a supranational organization, they don't count, but it is a good representation of what I talked about yesterday with supranational organizations and how they are like supranations. Again, regardless, the next up on there is India, and then ourselves, Brazil, Japan, Russia, Spain, France, Australia, Italy. You don't need to know those numbers, but you should know, again, the places that produce a huge amount of grain, again, for that process. And I would assume that you'd know those things even without me giving you this little table here. So let's go into our various different types of agriculture, starting with subsistence agriculture. So these are all going to fall under those, again, under that category where people are working a lot more by hand without as many tools, all that kind of stuff. That consumption is for the personal consumption, not so much for everything else. So first up on here is shifting. Got an extra G in there. Shifting agriculture, which is based on growing crops in different fields on a rotating basis. And then, of course, you're going to cut it down, burn what is there to enrich the soil with nutrients. Seeds planted just in time for the rainy season. Where you're going to see this most prevalent is in the Amazon basis. Shifting cultivation, again, or shifting agriculture, swidden agriculture, slash and burnt. They're all the same thing. Okay, they're just the same name for the same process, different names for the same process, and they're more common in tropical climates. Overall, it's intensive subsistence, meaning that it requires a lot of people and it requires a lot of work to get anything out of it. When we look at shifting agriculture, again, dependent upon a lot of the heavy inputs of fertilizer and human labor on a small piece of land for substantial crop yield. Again, other places where you can see this, China, India, Southeast Asia, they like double crop where they try and do 2 harvests of the same crop in a year, but only in those, again, more tropical or warmer, wetter climates. Another one, which is something that, again, I guess I didn't talk about specifically, but is more common now than it used to be, is urban subsistence farming. So this is basically like having your own garden, but much more productive. So it's a form of small city gardens, which are rapidly growing activity. It accounts at this point for 1/7 of the world food production. It's, again, something that's growing really rapidly in this modern day. And it's an important source of sustenance for poor urban families who are unable to buy adequate amounts of food. Oftentimes they have to be really smart. Again, this is still subsistence. They're doing things by hand. They don't have the tools and the access to a lot of things. So the waste and garbage that they create often will be recycled as fertilizer. You can see this in places like China, Taiwan, Cuba, Kenya, again, in the less developed areas of the world, or those areas that are, again, they need a lot of food production and they can't necessarily get it. The next one is pastoralism. Again, nomadic pastoralism is, again, another way of talking about it. This is a form of subsistence agriculture in which animals are herded, seasonal migration pattern. Again, they get to choose their breed, their herd. What are they going to actually go? You're going to find these mostly in arid or marginal lands, deserts, steppes. North Africa is good for pastoralism. Central Asia, the Middle East, again, where it's more deserty. Again, being able to utilize herding is definitely a more applicable kind of agriculture. Transhumanism is just a word that it's just, again, a higher level, college level word that might show up. Transhumanism is the moving herds constantly. Again, I think of like transportation, but it's transferring humans. So you yourself are going to move with your herd in sort of a pattern, again, overall. Moving into commercial, again, when we come right down to it, there are a lot of different types of farming that are out there. With commercial farming, it's very much about specifics. What is it that they're actually going to be growing? And they're going to be large scale. They're going to be highly mechanized. Not a lot of people work on these kinds of farms, but we've got ourselves mixed livestock and crop. Where you grow both the livestock and crops to feed them. Again, it's efficient, risk-reducing farming style, because if you have a bad crop, it's not as hard to get feed for your livestock, things like that. It's most prevalent form of agriculture in west of the Appalachian Mountains. So we're thinking, again, like the middle of the country going elsewhere. North and West Europe also engage in this type most often. If you look at the climates of those areas, they're pretty similar. Okay? Grain crops are usually what is going to be grown overall to be sold in markets and to be fed to the livestock. Oh, I'm sorry. I said that backwards. The crops are grown to be fed to the livestock, and then the livestock is sold off for money. Dairy farming. Again, this is the most important type of commercial agriculture and the first ring outside of large cities. That should sound sort of familiar because we'll talk about Van Thunen later. This first ring, or this area where milk can be properly given to the consumer in an appropriate amount of time, that space is the milk shed. The ring surrounding a city where milk can be supplied without going bad. There's been a lot of advancements in modes of transportation, so milk sheds have gotten a lot bigger over time. The process here is that, well, I mean, dairy farmers don't typically sell their milk directly to consumers. They sell it to wholesalers who then distribute it to a retailer, and then the retailer is going to get it to consumers. Again, of course, that same process can happen with other dairy products like butter and cheese. Again, the United States, Japan, we're big dairy farming people. Gardening and fruit farming, or truck farming. This type of approach here is predominant in really sunny, nice climate areas like Southeast United States. Again, most fruit and veg is sold to large processing companies. Again, you oftentimes are going to see migrant farm workers and large-scale automation, mechanization are going to happen in this style of farming because, again, you got to get the product to the consumer as soon as possible, especially with fruit and veg, because most consumers in the developed world don't like things that look gross, even if they're perfectly fine. So just seeing that kind of process overall. Specialty farming, this is a small minority kind of thing, exactly like what it sounds like, but it provides upscale customers with fresh produce. It's more direct kind of exchange as opposed to the large scale commercial gardening and fruit farming that's out there. Excuse me. Sorry. Then you got Mediterranean. This is a specialized type of agriculture known for producing specific crops like grapes or olives, citrus fruits, figs. It requires warm year-round climate with plenty of sunshine, as well as that lovely wind coming off of the sea. Again, it's always along coastlines, most often along western coastlines, because that's where you get the best kind of wind off the sea. Next one is going to be plantation. Plantation is also monocropping. Again, you pick one thing and you're going to make a lot of it and sell it for profit. This is, again, with plantation, usually have like a large estate specialized in that form of agriculture and is located normally in former colonial areas. We in the United States obviously use plantation farming for a long time until after the Civil War and our labor force changed. But other parts of the world still utilize this kind, even if they aren't colonies anymore. It's usually in tropical regions where there's a lot of rainfall. The soil is really good, so that you don't have to worry about sort of exhausting things. It's usually near coastlines. Again, they usually are working with workforces that don't mind being paid really little for working really hard. Plantation, even though it is commercial, what makes it commercial is the fact that they're selling for profit. Usually plantations are going to have a larger amount of people actively engaged in the farming process. You got grain farming, again, specialized agricultural activity where farmers grow one crop. Again, it's got to be a grain, obviously. We, the United States, we produce over 70% of corn and a large percent of the wheat in the world market, as our table earlier said, and it hits all of the big things. We, again, don't have a lot of people, a lot of machinery, fertilizers, GMO, which are genetically modified organisms. We'll talk about that later. Livestock and ranching. This is just, again, it's like pastoral nomadism, but it's much larger scale. It's less people and more of the animals, I suppose, and they're being sold almost exclusively for profit overall. So cattle and sheep grazing, it's most profitable to raise crops. It's more profitable, profitable to raise crops than livestock. So this is something that, again, it's pretty difficult to be very successful with. Again, it's declining in areas that have adequate rainfall because other types of crops and things are more, again, you just get more out of it. Again, locations are in South America, like Argentina, Australia, New Zealand. Again, I don't know what Africa that's supposed to be. South Africa, Spain, Portugal. They're areas that livestock and ranching is more popular. Moving on to Van Thunen. Van Thunen is the big again, theory for this unit overall and explains the relationship between the cost of land and cost of transport of the crop to market. The big thing about Van Thunen is this is an old theory. The main assumptions is that it's an isolated state, meaning that you're only trading with the people closest to you and not with the rest of the world. Land characteristics in this model are all uniform. It's all flat land. Again, everything is the same. In transportation, there's no roads or rivers. They just take them directly to the source of consumption. The most obvious thing about Van Thunen's model is the fact that perishable crops are located close to market and that livestock, the things that need more space, are further away. So a reminder, this is what it looks like. Oh, I'm sorry, I cannot stop yawning. This is what it looks like. Again, you've got one, which is the very typical, again, a straightforward concentric ring model, and then one that encapsulates a different mode of transportation in the form of a river. You can see that closest to the city or the consumer is going to be horticulture and dairying. So thinking, again, fruit and veg and dairy, things that go bad if you have to transport them long ways. Then you've got forestry, which is heavy. So heavy, of course, means transportation is more difficult, more expensive. Then it just gets a little bit more, again, open-ended. Crop and pasture, alternate use. So thinking mixed livestock and crop. Again, kind of just moving outward from there until the outsides are going to be for grazing for the large, again, modes of livestock ranching. Okay, so some add-on things. We're going to talk a little bit more specifically about the United States rural land use and settlement patterns. So originally, the way that, again, we as people settling the United States came, it was all based on the resources, such as agriculture, fishing, forestry, proximity to water, and what's happened as we as a country have spread out and found all these new places is that the increasing globalization of agriculture combined with the possible reduction of price supports to farmers contribute to the change over rural farmlands to alternate land use. You're going to see that in the United States, more and more land that was once farmland or dedicated for agriculture is being turned into other things. So whether that's housing or employment, recreation, water storage, it makes the farms that still exist in the United States much, much, much more difficult, their job overall, because, well, again, it's a struggle, number one, to make money. And number two, you've got all these other demands on the land. So this is something that kind of further impacts how many people are actually engaged in agriculture, and the fact that agriculture in the United States, like a lot of more developed countries, is kind of dying out because there are other parts of the world who are producing food that we can get it from. We don't have to produce the food ourselves, all that kind of stuff. Again, it's a big thing. 75% of the United States live in urban areas or in suburban areas, and only 25% live in the rural parts of the country still. And the demand on that land for other things is just decreasing that number more and more. There are three factors that affect that pattern. Again, the kind of resources that attract people to an area, transportation methods available, again, how to get there, and the role of government policy, especially the land survey system. So how is it that the land is being, again, chopped up into pieces, and what is being designated as, again, agriculture versus residential versus so on and so forth down the line, right? The big takeaway there is that originally agriculture dictated everything about how we settled in the country, and over time, as it loses its stance or importance into our overall American economy, it just gets shrinking. It just keeps shrinking. How many people are actually in agriculture? How much land is actually being used for agriculture across the country? Talk about biotech a little bit more specifically. So this is the application of scientific technology to modify and improve plants to enhance their value. In the Green Revolution, the introduction of GMOs happened, again, genetically modified organism. They were created when scientists took one or more specific genes and they spliced them into another organism, transformed using genetic engineering tech called transgenic organism. Approximately 65 to 75% of food products today contains at least a small quantity of crops that were produced with GMOs. Tomatoes were the first one where they took different varietals of them and they like put them together to figure out kind of like how can we make the juiciest, the best, the most productive tomato that there is. And then it just went from there. It was started to be applied. Now GMO, again, is trying to produce vaccines and insulin in certain food plants. Ultimately, what biotech is it's the combination of science, technology to food to see if we can get other things out of it. Okay. So GMOs is something that a lot of people, after people figured out what they were, they kind of, there's like backlash about them. But ultimately, they're not. Again, there's a lot of literature out there that says GMOs like are bad for us, but there's not actual lot of good evidence that supports that idea. Regardless, again, people again have a resistance to consuming foods with GMOs in it. So we're going to see again a resurgence or again coming out of the woodwork of organic farming. Organic farming, in the system that's very popular today, obviously you see it on stickers on all kinds of things now, is the process of producing food naturally. So you don't use fertilizers, you don't use GMOs. Again, you just try and grow what is supposed to. The other thing about organic farming is it's a lot about sustainability. Again, trying not to hurt the environment to produce food. So it's protecting the Earth's resources, and it produces safe food for consumption with zero impact. So there's no fertilizers getting into the ground, and there's no pesticides getting into the water, and there's no drugs or animal hormones. So again, the animals that livestock are going to be raised are going to be perfectly natural, not plumped up with a bunch of extra stuff or any of the things that we saw in our Food Inc. documentary. Over time, again, organic farming has become much more in demand because we, as a human population, decided that we'd really like our food to not be filled with toxins and residues. It's fresher, it's more nutritious. It helps local economies because it's smaller scale. Organic farming at its heart is smaller scale. It can't be commercial farming in the same sort of way. Yes, they're trying to, again, make money, but if you sacrifice your quality and your approach to make money, which is the only way to do so in agriculture, then of course it changes the kind of product that you create. Other sort of, again, things to keep in mind about agriculture in this unit. One is desertification. This is basically something that started to happen in areas where there is a high amount of agriculture, which desertification is exactly what it sounds like. It's taking land and turning it into a desert. So you're overgrazing and you're eroding too much of the topsoil. There's not enough water coming in, so on and so forth. There are other bad impacts that come from agriculture. Again, soils can become depleted, polluted. Of course, to make farmland, there's been massive deforestation, cutting down of trees. When pesticides and fertilizers get into the soil, get into the water, it can kill all kinds of other things that are important as far as an ecosystem goes. Water tables get depleted because of irrigation taking too much without, again, it being replenished. There are health problems from those working in industry, again, working in the industry of agriculture, from being in close contact with a lot of this stuff for extended periods of time. This brings up the idea of sustainability. Like I said, organic farming has a lot to do with sustainability. It's that principle that we must meet our present needs without compromising the future. It's got to last. It's got to last forever. And the way that agriculture has worked for the last however many years has really damaged the environment in some ways irreparably. We can't fix it. And so, again, sustainability in agriculture oftentimes get talked about, figuring out how do we do that? How do we still produce enough food for the population while still, again, being able to economically make money and protect the environment, and of course socially tap into what people want, the demands that people have. Conservation agriculture is another. Okay, so this is the way to apply some of the organic farming techniques to commercial agriculture overall. That's about optimizing crop yields and profits without hurting the environment as best as possible. With conservation agriculture, the methods that they try and do to take those commercial farms and make them better is to reduce the use of fossil fuels, to not use other things that could pollute the environment. With conservation agriculture being more thoughtful about the environment, common practices, things that they do, conservation crop rotation. So again, flipping where you grow crops so that they doesn't get too used up. Conservation tillage, allowing a crop residue to stay on top of the field rather than being like swept away, so that that can break down and it can go into the soil. Terracing, and making little steps into a sloping land in order to allow water to soak into the soil rather than to like just slide right down it. That erodes the topsoil and it hurts it. Grassed waterways, creating broad, shallow depression that is planted with grasses to prevent erosion, again, to slow runoff, to make that harder to happen. These are some more add-on things, some smaller items, various different things that are happening here. This right here, these are all value-added agriculture items. And what that means is that in this kind of approach, you're going to see that the agricultural system, there's more value that comes out of it based off of these things. So you've got cottage industry, which is processed on the farm and significantly increases the value, and more money goes directly to the farmer, because in cottage industry, people are still doing things by hand, and they're selling directly to the customer. There is no middle person there. Okay. Appellation, again, where you see local or regional geographic name for a product. What ends up happening with this is that the names are also protected so that they're the only products that are allowed to have that particular thing. So, two examples of this: champagne. Uh, there is one specific region in the entire world, the Champagne region, that only wines produced from those grapes can be called champagne. Anything else is sparkling wine. So the idea here is that they have like trademarked it and only them. So that adds value to the product and it allows for them to be more successful. Again, Parmesan Reggiano is the same thing. Again, Parmesan Reggiano is a type of cheese that if it doesn't have if it's not produced in the city, the area surrounding the city of Parma in Italy, it's not called that. Okay. Aquaculture is another. This is something that has become much more profitable over time, which is rapidly growing industry of fish farming. Okay, so small farmers can engage in and be profitable. Suitcase farmers, this is kind of an interesting one. These are farm owners who have city jobs but still own land in rural areas. So they're going to tend to engage in specialty crop farming. So that specialty agriculture I talked about, to add extra and to keep family traditions alive. And people, again, they find that really appealing and they're willing to pay more money for that kind of stuff. And then specialty dairy. So processed cheese and yogurt production has continually moved west over the last 150 years. So from New England to Wisconsin, and obviously, in that way, there have been new methods that make the dairy product, again, it's like a more sought after from the way that it's created. This particular pasteurization, ultra high temperature, is a new milk preservation method, and it allows for people to be able to access this, again, highly sought after dairy product all around the country without losing the value. This right here is just a list of farming techniques. Overall, is the last thing in this, again, add-on slash agriculture item. I know it's kind of a long PowerPoint of information, but again, trying to help you get all the things. So these are different key terms and ideas that might show up. Again, I just wish I could be more specific, but unfortunately I can't. So human ecology. Again, this is used to describe human interactions with nature. So our human environment interactions. Agriculture obviously is a huge aspect of that, of understanding how we interact with nature, because we are the ones who are creating these goods through our relationship with what's around us environmentally. Food web, and each type of crop animal is dependent on a number of human inputs: the soil, the climate collection or conditions, other crops, agriculture, farmers. They have to think about that. The food web overall. Food chain. You guys know how this works. Food chain is obviously a scientific term, biology-wise, describes the order of predators in the animal world, and is also used to describe several integrated human mechanical inputs. So the food chain has changed a little bit because we have inserted ourselves into that process and we've manipulated it. Crop rotation, talked about earlier, again, where you take one crop, plant it in a plot of land, and then you switch it for a different one. Double cropping or triple cropping. planting 2 or 3 crops, one after another on a single plot. So this idea of just using the same plot of land in a shorter timeline. Growing season. When do plants typically grow? Every plant is different. Again, you plant in the spring, it grows in the summer, you harvest in the fall is the basic breakdown for a lot of crops, but not all of them. There are certain crops that if you're smart about it, you can do the opposite, or shift it so that you can be planting different crops and harvesting all year round. So one example of that is winter wheat, which is grown in more of the southern areas of the Great Plains where it doesn't get quite so cold. You plant in the fall, you leave dormant in the winter, and then you harvest in the spring. So again, those people who live in places like Kansas and Oklahoma and Colorado, they could be harvesting wheat all year round. Again, there's just different types of wheat or varietals there. Aquifer. An aquifer is an underground water used for irrigation. Conservation, again, trying to preserve, manage the environment and your resources. Interplanting is planting fast-growing crops right alongside slow-growing crops. So you have one crop that is going to take a while, but the others you're going to just, so you, again, you can always be working, always producing a product. Sustainable yield. Again, the amount of crops or animals that can be raised without endangering local resources. So again, you're not going to overgraze the fields, you're not going to suck out too many of the nutrients, and it's not too expensive to make it work. Non-food crops. What this is looking at is, again, the types of crops that are not going to be used for human consumption. That's what you should think of it as. So industrial use, again, textiles, animal feed, those are examples of non-food crops. Whew. It's a lot of information, and you should split it up over the 2 days here. So we've got, again, work to be completed by tomorrow before 1. Make sure that you're looking through your Unit 5, finding out what it is, questions and concerns-wise. Friday, there's going to be an interactive review game of some kind. Look out for directions on that. By Monday at the latest, I've already posted it, so you should be posting. I've seen people posting already. Putting your tips and tricks for Unit 4 and 5. And again, the College Board exam is only 6 days away. Make sure you're checking out the information of Classroom. If you are taking the exam, you have to do these 2 steps if you want to be fully prepared besides your studying. One is to check to see if you're getting emails from My AP Classroom, and if not, just log in. Go to your account info, your profile, and see that your email is the right email. Remember, your e-ticket is going to come directly to you 2 days before the exam. They'll email it to you. It'll also be in your My AP Classroom, so just log on to check. The other thing that you should, again, you have to do before the exam day is go through the exam demo on the device you plan to use to make sure that your technology is all good to go and set and it works. That's the biggest thing to keep in mind here, okay? So making sure that you've got that all ready to go. If you've got questions specifically about other stuff, feel free to reach out, email, do what you got to do. I hope you guys have a good day, and I will see you all tomorrow.